Hi, my name is Rebecca Lucero, and today we're going to be discussing diversity and addiction. So I'd like to start off by asking you a question. Why do you think diversity is important for the study and treatment of addiction? Just think about that for a moment. If we look at history and we look at previous studies of addiction, you can see that often the studies or research has been done with white participants. So a lot of the studies have been kind of focusing on how to help and treat people who come from a particular culture. And this leaves out many others who come from different cultures and have different risk factors and protective factors that impact how they view and treat substance abuse. So we're going to be going through this PowerPoint and just talking about different minority groups that need to be included in the study of addiction. We're going to be particularly looking at some different racial groups. These are larger minorities within the US population, and then we're also going to be looking at the LGBT community. I hope this PowerPoint is helpful in helping you to understand the unique influences and culture and also risk and protective factors for these different groups. First, let's start off by talking about different factors or identities when it comes to diversity. First is age. Often when we look at addiction, there are a lot of studies that do look at youth versus adults and the differences that exist within those two different populations. We're not going to be discussing that a ton today since we have a different lecture that focuses on adolescence, but just be aware that it's important to distinguish different things that impact youth who are using substances and also adults. There are some gender differences when it comes to substance abuse, although both genders use and have substance abuse problems. That's also something that may impact the way people view or influenced when it comes to substance abuse and treatment. Sexual orientation, we will be discussing this more in depth at the end of the presentation and talking about some risk and protective factors that have to do with when people have a different sexual orientation than the majority. We're going to be highlighting 4 different racial groups, and obviously within each racial group there are different cultures or subgroups, different ethnic groups. We're going to be taking a closer look at some findings from research of these groups. We will also be looking at culture, and this often can intersect with race, but not always. Also, able status. We're not going to be talking about that much today, but just to realize that there's diversity in terms of how able people are. So we have people that may be mentally impaired or physically impaired and how that might affect their use of substances. So I just want you to ponder that there's many different things that might impact how someone views substances and how they use substances, and also what it would mean for these people if they were to have a substance abuse disorder, how they would resolve that or seek treatment. It's important to recognize that it might not be the same for everybody. We won't be thoroughly discussing religion, but when we talk about the different races and cultural groups, we will be touching on some religious aspects that impact how these cultures view substance abuse and the treatment of substance abuse. I think this quote is a great example of why it is important to consider diversity when you are studying or treating addiction. Addiction affects particular families differently in part because various subcultures have different norms for family and social behaviors. So if we don't take into account what are norms for these different cultures, then often we can be treating things that maybe don't need treatment, or the treatments won't work because they don't account for the different ways that these cultures operate. So we're going to be talking about a few definitions that are important that will continue throughout the PowerPoint. So we're going to talk about enculturation. Enculturation is the process of developing a culture based on being raised in it. Acculturation is the process of psychological, interpersonal, and behavioral changes that results from interaction between different cultures. This would also be relevant for someone who has immigrated and how they come with a certain culture and then they participate in a new culture and the different changes that may take place as they take on parts from the new culture. Ethnic identity. Ethnic identity is an individual identification based on shared social experience or ancestry. So our first group that we're going to discuss today is African Americans. About 45% of families are led by a female single parent. Most of the time when we're looking at literature or research, most of the research and treatment has focused on having a 2-parent household. We know that single parents are more common these days in general, but among African Americans, 45% is a pretty high number as well. And so it'll be important for anybody who's treating anyone with a substance disorder that they would know about these family dynamics and that they're different than maybe what they've seen typically. So this statistic highlights the matricentric female-headed family pattern, right? That women are the head of the household. And this varies greatly from many other cultures where the male is considered to be the leader or the head of the household, right? When you have 45% of women leading the household alone, that family dynamic is going to be different. Also, when we think about African Americans, it's important to realize that the average income is a low income. The median income for an African American family was $33,916 in 2007. This is one of the lowest incomes when looking at different racial groups. So it's important to realize that poverty might be impacting how this family operates and may influence risk factors for children or adults when it comes to substance abuse disorders. African Americans are known to have the lowest rates for alcohol, cigarettes, and illicit drugs. But while they have lower rates, it's important to realize that they have a higher mortality rate, 10% higher for alcohol-related diseases. So the effects of alcohol on this group may be more detrimental. Also, it's important to realize that cocaine is typically the drug of choice. So sometimes among different cultures, we'll see that different drugs are more prominent, and cocaine is a drug that is more prominent for this racial group than the other drugs such as alcohol, cigarettes, and illicit drugs. And the thing to note about cocaine is that cocaine has a higher relapse rate. Well, overall, African Americans are using less. Sometimes when they do use, sometimes the consequences are greater or the chance of relapse is greater. So substance abuse for a lot of African Americans is seen as a secondary problem to the context of racism and poverty. In this way, substance abuse is seen as kind of a symptom of the problem. So the reasoning for this is that often African Americans have been socially excluded. We've seen that with segregation in our history, slavery. Even though slavery has ended and segregation has ended, there's still some social exclusion as a result of those institutional practices. As a result of this racial group suffering, they've needed a way to cope, and so often they see this as a symptom of a problem. The problem is the racial oppression, and then the way of coping has, for some people, been substance abuse. Peer influence is very important for African Americans when it comes to substance abuse. It's obviously important for most racial groups in general, but African Americans tend to interact more with their same racial group. So what this means is that African Americans are, for the most part, interacting with other African Americans. And in that way, people of their same race and culture are often influencing them as peers. Also, when it comes to peer influence, it often can be a negative influence, especially if other peers are using. Because they tend to interact more with the same racial group, it has a greater effect on them. And so if their peers are using substances, then it will be more likely that they will use substances as well. Poverty is always a risk factor for anyone when it comes to substance abuse, but knowing that African Americans so often have been socially excluded or pushed out, and that often now they live in poverty, either because the household is run by a single parent, right? Obviously, it's going to be harder to make more money if you're the breadwinner and the caretaker. And so recognizing that poverty can be a great risk factor for this particular group. In high poverty communities, there will often be lower family cohesion, so this can be a risk factor that's associated with poverty, which contributes to substance abuse. Also, sometimes the communities can have violent neighborhoods. This is pretty typical of any impoverished neighborhood, right? There's typically more crime there, so this would also be a risk factor for youth and for adults. And now we're going to take a look at protective factors for African Americans. One thing to know is that most of the time, African Americans have positive attitudes towards their ethnic identification. So they take a lot of pride in their ethnicity, and that is often a protective factor against the use of substances. Afrocentrism refers to the values, beliefs, and behaviors that are derived from the African culture and religion. Having strong ties to these values, beliefs, and behaviors is a protective factor for African Americans. Also, their religious values. Religion can often be a protective factor when it comes to substance abuse and substance use, and this is very true within the African American community. Often traditional family practices will also be a protective factor for African American families. When families engage in traditions, that often helps preserve that sense of identity, that feeling of belonging and identity. It is often a protective factor for anyone and for particularly this group of people. Also, social support. Social support is also seen as a very important protective factor for African Americans. Social support may come by way of community, neighborhood, or even a church. This can be particularly helpful when someone might be from a single parent home, that they would have a greater community that offers support that works to protect children or youth from engaging in substance abuse. Risk factors for African Americans include less access to resources, social exclusion, low income, low education rates. While there are many African Americans that graduate high school, very few attend college and graduate. So just be aware that these are some of the risk factors that this ethnic group faces. Next, we're going to discuss Hispanic and Latin American families. Hispanic and Latin American families comprise the largest minority of the U.S. They comprise 16% of the general population. Also be aware that they have lower incomes than white people do in America. The median income is $38,679, and that was in 2007. And remember that median means that's the middle. So median is not an average, but that means that that is the center income. So if you take all of the incomes and you were to line them up, that would be the one that is in the center. And this is about $5,000 higher than it was for the African Americans. Female single-parent homes comprise 22.6%, so that's a significant percentage of single-parent homes. They have lower education rates in terms of both high school graduation and college graduation. They have strong nuclear family units. And it's important to realize that there's certain principles or beliefs that kind of guide how their families organize. Patriarchy is an ideology that purports that men should hold the control and should lead the family. Marianism is also an ideology that focuses on how women should be cherished and also will often be the center of the home. So just be aware that there are some certain beliefs or values that guide how these families are organized. One important thing to note about Hispanic and Latin American families is that they have the highest lifetime prevalence rates of alcohol, cigarette, licit and illicit drug use of any other race. So what this means is that when there is a substance use disorder, that will carry over time, that it will last longer. Also, to demonstrate that difference, note that the annual prevalence rate for Hispanic or Latin Americans is 20.9%, and that's compared to 14.6% for African Americans and 14.9% for Caucasians. So you can see that it's about 6% difference. That's a pretty large difference. Also, when we look at Hispanics, they initiate drug use earlier than other racial groups. This means that children or youth are using at a younger age. And we've kind of discussed that earlier in our course, that often how young you use is a risk factor for the development of a substance use disorder. Also, United States-born Hispanic adolescents report higher drug use rates than foreign-born Hispanics. And we'll kind of go over a little bit more about how immigration and acculturation impacts this group, but it is interesting to note that often Hispanics born in the United States use more drugs than foreign-born Hispanics. In addition, higher levels of acculturation correlate with higher levels of substance use. So we're going to go over some risk factors for Hispanic and Latin Americans. Often they have poor access to health care. This may be because they may or may not be here legally, and so they may not have access to certain health care. That may be one factor for this group of people. Also, there can be language barriers. So being able to access different resources within the community, if you're not able to communicate, that can obviously impact how many resources you can access. Legal status. Along with legal status comes a lot of access to resources, and so legal status can impact this group. Young, unmarried, and underemployed males among this group often have higher rates of use and substance abuse. Youth who don't live with parents, they often are at greater risk of developing a substance disorder. Also, there can be discrepancies in acculturation rates between teens and parents. So what this means is that often teens are acculturating at a faster rate than their parents, so they may be more well-versed in the language, in the culture, and as they take on different elements of the general U.S. American culture and their parents are preserving the culture that they come from, there can be discord in the family, disconnection among the parents and the children. And as they become more distant, that often heightens the risk for substance abuse. Some protective factors for the Hispanic Latin community: being an employed female seems to help reduce the risk of substance abuse. Also, youth that live with their parents have lower rates of use. High parental presence, so when parents are more involved with their children, that is also a protective factor for youth. Familialism, this is the idea that high connectedness or cohesion between family members is valued within this community, and that concept, as it's lived out and you see it in behaviors, is a protective factor for people among this community. Also, associating with peers who don't use substances is a protective factor. So often we talk about peer influence being a negative thing. It can also be a very positive thing when peers are not using. Peers are often influenced to use less or not at all. All right, next we're going to take a look at Asian American families and the factors that impact them. They are the fastest growing ethnic group in the U.S. They comprise 5% of the general population here in the U.S. They have a high income. Their median income is $66,103 in 2007. So you can see that this income is much higher than the incomes that we highlighted for the other racial groups that we went over. Asian Americans have the highest education rates of any ethnic group in the U.S. They also have the highest rates of marriage. In addition, they have the lowest substance abuse rates of any ethnic group. Subgroups have different rates of abuse. So sometimes if you're looking at subgroups such as like a Japanese ethnic group, they would have similar rates to Caucasian Americans in terms of substance abuse. But overall, if you group all the Asian groups together, which is a lot of groups, a lot of times people think of Asian Americans, they're typically thinking of just persons from China or Japan or maybe Vietnam, maybe Thailand, maybe Korea, but this would also include India and other countries in Asia. It's important to realize that Asia is a very large continent that has many different people who come from different cultures, and so looking at those subgroups might be helpful when you're working with someone from a particular culture. Asian Americans are less likely to report a substance abuse problem. They're also less likely to seek out treatment. They are also more likely to be forced by work or loved ones to enter treatment. One thing that characterizes Asian American families is this loyalty to family, and often that means not doing anything that would be shameful for the family. So often it can be a barrier to seeking treatment to admit that you have a significant problem with substance abuse. So often it would be the family that would intervene, and that may be a good thing, that may be a bad thing. It may mean that it got really bad, that finally work or family had to enforce it, and it may be a good thing in the sense that family is aware of what's going on and maybe seeks earlier intervention in order to help their loved ones. So we're going to take a look at some risk factors for Asian Americans. So racial discrimination is a huge one, and this is obviously true for any of the ethnic groups that we're looking at today, but this is one that has been noted by Asian Americans, that this is something that significantly affects them. Also, higher acculturation in youth. So this is similar, to what we talked about with Hispanic and Latin Americans, that higher rates of acculturation often are a risk factor for youth and the development of substance abuse disorders. So again, what this means is that youth are acculturating faster than parents, and as they align themselves more with some typical U.S. American or Caucasian values, that creates discord in the family, which increases their risk for the development of a substance disorder. Also, peer use is a risk factor. So if peers are using, that will negatively influence them to use. Masculine norms is also another risk factor. So feeling pressure to be masculine and feeling that using substances such as drinking would be a way of asserting one's masculinity can also be a risk factor for youth among Asian Americans. Now we're going to take a look at some protective factors for Asian Americans. First is academic achievement. So we talked about how they have the highest education rates. Having high academic achievement is also a protective factor for this group. Value of emotional control is a protective factor. So obviously when you use substances, you have less control over your emotions. The fact that this culture values emotional control would be a deterrent for using substances that would put that in jeopardy. Parental attachment. So often these families are very cohesive. As children and youth are attached to their parents, this will be a protective factor against substance use and abuse. Collectivism is also a protective factor. Collectivism is basically a belief that one should focus on what's best for the group over what's best for the individual. So often you'll see these families that each person acts in the interest of the group and not just the individual. And this can be very different from Caucasian US American values that focus on individuals. Also, filial piety, loyalty to family, respect of elders, works as a protective factor for this group. Also, religiosity is also a protective factor. Religion often functions in a way that reduces one's risk for substance abuse. Next, we're going to look at Native American families. They comprise 2% of the general U.S. population, and they're one of the fastest growing ethnic groups in the U.S. 58% of households of Native Americans are led by married parents. It's important to note that often these marriages are a result of intermarriage. What this means is that they're marrying someone who is outside of their ethnic group. So most of the time this will be Caucasians, but it could be someone from another ethnic group, but just be aware that they often intermarry. 40% live on reservations, so 60% are not living on reservations, so just be mindful. Sometimes there might be stereotypes that assume that most are living on reservations. It's about 40%, which is a good amount of people, but it is not the majority. The median income for this group is about $42,000, and that was taken in 2008. So this is a little bit more than some racial groups, but less than others. It's also important to note that this group has the highest dropout rates for high school, so the education rates are going to be low among this group. Kinship is also important for Native Americans. This kind of refers to their respect of elders in their community. When looking at Native American families, it's important to note that they have high drinking rates. 1/4 to 1/3 exhibit a substance abuse problem. This is probably one of the higher rates of substance abuse. When looking at this group of people, 1/4 to 1/3 of the population that has substance abuse problems, it's important to know what actually happens within that group. So within this 1/3 of this ethnic group, 75% of these men and 40% of these women will have a lifetime substance use disorder. So when they have a substance use disorder, this is lasting a long time. Also, it's important to note that children and youth start drinking earlier among Native American families. And when we're talking about Native American families, this is both Native Alaskans and also American Indians. Tribe diversity also can make it difficult to draw conclusions. So this can be kind of similar to when we were talking about Asian Americans, how often there's some different subgroups that may display different characteristics when it comes to drinking and values and the way that they use substances. So sometimes it can be difficult to draw specific conclusions, but when we're looking at this group as a whole, these are some of the things that we find. Also, they have high rates of fetal alcohol syndrome, and it's about 5 to 6 times higher than general population. So we see that when people are drinking, they're also getting pregnant, and then they're not stopping the drinking while they're pregnant. So then this is obviously affecting their children in the next generation. They also have high rates of social consequences related with drinking. So they have higher rates of STDs and cirrhosis of the liver. So not only do they have higher rates of use, but when they do use, they suffer more of the consequences that are a result of using. Now we're going to take a look at some of the conflicting messages about drinking in particular for Native American families. First, there is this notion and this belief that drinking is about connecting with others. And many of you may be able to relate to this, right? A lot of people get excited to go to the game and have a beer, tailgating, going to the bar with friends, right? Often drinking is about connecting with others, and this is a belief within this ethnic group. So there's this positive message about drinking, that drinking helps us to connect with one another. It's also sometimes seen as part of Native life and identity, that this is what their group does. I'm sure that you all can think of other ethnic groups that have a lot of identity around alcohol, and it's viewed as part of life. It is also seen as a symbol of courage and masculinity. So again, we see a positive message that if you drink, this is a symbol that you're courageous and masculine. These are some different beliefs that encourage the use of alcohol. It can also be a symbol of cultural degradation and loss. And this leads to my next point, that problem drinking often reduces transmission of traditional values and practices. So as drinking becomes the focus in a family, the family organizes around the addiction, we can see that those families often lose the tradition and practices that have characterized their family for centuries. So now we're going to take a look at some Native American risk factors. Gender is a risk factor, so men are much more likely to use than women. Poverty is a risk factor, right? When we look at the median income, we can see that many people are impoverished if the median income is only $42,000. Also, family history of drinking. And we've talked about this in other lectures where we talk about genetic makeup and obviously the way that our families organize impacts, but family history is a big influence on whether or not a Native American might use or develop a substance abuse disorder. Low parental monitoring is also a risk factor, so if parents are not involved, then we'll see higher rates of substance abuse. Peers using is also a risk factor, so when peers are using substances, then more than likely that person will use substances as well. And usually that person will develop a substance abuse disorder if their peers or friends are also dealing with a substance use disorder. Acculturation, again, like with other groups, is a risk factor for this group. When we look at protective factors, we find that cultural pride is a protective factor. So again, similar to other ethnic groups we looked at, when individuals take pride in their ethnic identity, that is a protective factor. Also, spirituality is a protective factor, and just kind of like we talked about on different slides, we've seen that religiosity. Sometimes spirituality and religiosity go hand in hand, but for Native Americans, the best way to describe that is spirituality, and that is a protective factor often for this group. Also, parental involvement is a protective factor for this group as well. Now we'll be taking a look at the LGBTQ community and some factors that influence their use of substances and substance abuse rates, and also risk factors and protective factors for this community. So in 2012, approximately 3.4% identified as LGBT in the US. So about 3.5% of the US population is LGBT. But studies have not been very conclusive if the substance abuse rate is higher among this population or not. Early studies estimate that they had rates of 30%. That's a pretty high rate for any ethnic group to have 30% of persons suffering from some kind of substance abuse disorder. But other studies show that the substance abuse disorder rates are about 14%. So, I mean, that's a pretty big difference. That's half. So you can see how different those numbers are, and so it's unclear if this population is at greater risk for the development of substance abuse than the general population. One thing that studies have found is that lifetime use of any illicit substance is higher for both gay men and women than their heterosexual counterparts. So although the use rates may not be higher, how long they're using them throughout their life is greater. Also, one thing to note is that alcohol consumption does not decline with increasing age for this group. Typically, for when we look at heterosexual persons, alcohol use rates decline with age, and we don't see that happening for people who are part of the LGBTQ community. Those rates stay pretty steady as people age. So now we're going to be talking about some risk and protective factors for the LGBTQ community. Some risk factors. First and foremost is discrimination. Often this can be both legally and socially. We find that people of this community are often discriminated against. And when we looked at different ethnic groups, we also saw that discrimination was a factor that impacted someone's risk for the development of a substance abuse disorder. Also, social pressures is a risk factor. People from this community can often feel pressure to fit in and act a certain way to please the majority, and there can be a lot of social pressures for this group. Also, internalized homophobia is considered to be a risk factor. This is something that I have seen actually in my own life. A loved one in my family started to have some problem drinking, And we were very concerned about this individual and what was going on because the drinking just kept getting worse and they seemed to not be recognizing the negative consequences or taking them seriously. And so it took someone sitting down with this individual and talking to them about the drinking problem. And then the person finally opened up and shared that they were gay. And when that happened, the drinking drastically reduced, right? When this person found that they were supported and loved, regardless of sexual orientation, then the person was no longer relying on alcohol to help them fit in or repress a part of themselves. So internalized homophobia can definitely impact how someone uses substances. There's a lot of shame that someone can experience with being gay because of all of the negative messages that they receive from other people in their lives. And so when somebody feels shame, often they will use substances. And so we can see that a lot with this community, that shame could drive someone to abuse substances. Protective factors, on the other hand, family support is a protective factor. So when someone from the LGBTQ community finds that they have great family support in their identity and in their life, that will be a protective factor against the development of substance abuse disorder. Also, attachment to parents is very similar to family support, but that is also a protective factor among this population. I'm sure a lot of you have seen in the media or heard from friends that often when people come out, often their parents might disown them. So when people from the LGBTQ community have great attachment to their parents and have strong relationships with their parents, then we see that they are protected from the development of a substance abuse disorder. So I hope this PowerPoint helped you to see why diversity is so important when we're looking at addiction. And I hope that you learned a lot about these different groups that will be helpful to you in your professional pursuits.